Yep. Good. Click allow. Okay. The back one isn't working, so we're just doing the best we can. Would you do me a favor and just kind of check around with the other ones, making sure everyone's okay? Thank you. Kind of managing multiple rooms at the same time.
So I'll just give you an nod. Like there's quite a few rooms pretty quickly. So maybe just give me a thumb. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there's plenty of room now.
And they added another room after this the next hour. So now, before we just hit only 2 and 3, and now we've got 4.
Yeah. So we'll get started, and I want to introduce wannamaker, who comes to us. I don't know. Moved a lot.
Yes, I have moved a lot, but I'm currently in my own.
Right. And this is Karen's qualifying presentation. And what I've watched with Karen over the past 3 years is a transformation in how to use constructive education. Karen started out very, very interested in data-driven decision-making processes and moved towards, actually probably from the beginning, worked with ELL students, English language learners, and that transition has opened up many, many other doors for Karen. And I think the bridge between Monique's presentation working with underrepresented groups and Karen's is very profound in terms of self-discovery. And I would ask you at some point in here, even if you wait for the beginning, to repeat the story you told me. I think you could do that, please, about what it means to work with families. With this, Monique has been very conscientious about incorporating families and inviting the right students to her classroom. Karen has very similar work with a different book.
Okay, thank you. So the topic from when I wrote my paper to now has shifted a little bit. So those of you that are expecting simply disruption, there's a little more to this story. I want to start with just a little bit about who I am and how I got involved in education. I was a college dropout, and that really defined me for my first two careers. I've had a lot of success bucking the system. I worked for 20 years as a professional photographer. I traveled the world. I had an amazing career. And then I adopted a little girl from China. And I realized I could no longer travel. I needed to find another profession and something that I could be really passionate about. And as I watched her grow, I thought, she's going into that public education system. And I thought, wow, how did work so well for me? And so I started thinking about the public education system, and I started wondering, in the almost 30 years since I've been out of it, what changes have taken place and what she might find in there. And it led me down a road to actually Prescott College the first time. And I got my undergrad here. And in doing so, I met some amazing people, and I got into the schools. And I was afforded the ability within the public education school to do these amazing projects. Project-based, I would put in, I would get all these people working together, I'd fly on out, and everything was great. And then I got a classroom. And so go ahead and, oops, right? Let's keep trying. I think if you just hit it again, there we go. Keep going. And so I was hired as an English language teacher. I was told there's 120 kids that are in this school. They're all below proficiency. Most of them, I was only in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. Most of them reading at about a kindergarten level, some of them 1st grade, if I was lucky. And then I was told, well, there's 120, but you're only allowed to work with the lowest 10% class because the others are fine. And I thought, oh, okay. And so I got into a classroom, and I had 4 children. And I kept thinking, what about the other 100 and some odd? And so I thought, well, obviously this isn't working. There were 3 of us, and we each had about 4 kids. And so I thought, okay, well, I know how to do this, right? Like, I've run a business for 20 years. I can roll up my sleeves. I can get to work. I can make a plan. I can put together a proposal. I'm going to present it to the school board. I'm going to go back. I can present it, right? This is like a corporation. This is the real world. I'm going to go. I'm going to show my PowerPoint. I'm going to present it. I'm going to change the world. Now you can go forward. The 3 slides in, this was my principal. I wasn't even allowed to present my idea that I had worked for months to put together. I called schools all over the country. I'd done research. I found out what was working in other schools. And yet, 3 slides in, I realized, I'm a brand new teacher. I bring no life experience. There's nothing that I can offer this in her life. So I took a step back. And I worked with my 1 class. And this red, well, the blue is the growth prior to this class. The red is how much they grew, just simply given the opportunity to have 15 minutes a day with someone that truly cared about them, somebody that was trying to put their needs. Well, this was a really small project, but my boss, who wasn't my principal, come about April, she said to me, "I'm sorry, we can't really talk about it." And I thought, what? And so I went to the superintendent and said, "No, the principal has decided." So I went back, and I thought that was a short period in education. I had a year of it. But somehow over the summer, the person who she had replaced me with was unable to come back. And so she was forced to call me back in at the last minute. Well, the next year, we completely changed the program. I kind of thought, okay, I've come in with a mandate for that before. So we completely changed the program. We took a replacement reading program. We moved it to a science and social studies curriculum. We taught language through science and social studies. We co-taught with certain classrooms, and these big lines that go up are the kids that were in this program where we saw them twice a day. We truly tried to meet their needs. We felt like we rocked their world. This is their English language proficiency. We had 0 kids. 100% of the kids we worked with were over the 40th percentile. Most of them gained over 75th percentile. Some of them were at the very top of all kids in the nation on English language growth. And I thought, okay, now I've got a job, right? But unfortunately, I still have the same principal. So once again, I was told, we're sorry, but frankly, there's teachers that we've hired to come and replace you that have much better skills. They're much more qualified. Now, these were kids just out of school. They've never been doing this. And so I held the distinction of being the only teacher ever in the history of our school district that was recommended for tenure that actually was an office job. And so once again, my experience with the public school system was a bit lacking. But thankfully, not because of anything that I did, not because of the way that she taught or worked at the school, but she decided to move back to a classroom. And at the very last minute, 3 days before the next school year, the new principal called and said, "Come back." And so once again, I stepped back into the classroom, but this time I thought, okay, well, I've got all this data, we have all these numbers, but we had this really amazing facilitator, and she helped me to think about what was really important. And so, go ahead, I asked the kids, because she helped me see, well, they know way more than I do. So see if we could, oops, okay. Okay, let me go see if I can, sorry. Okay, yep, there you go. So I asked them, if you could tell your teacher one thing, what would you tell them? This is what they said. and all the students in my classroom and some of your classrooms, I thought, huh, there has to be something going on that I don't understand. Why is it that my principal, who I believe to this day truly wanted as much for the kids as I did, who truly believed in kids just like I did, how is it that with all of the research and all of the information available to us, what happens? What's the disconnect between the moment we step into that classroom and all the education that's come before us? And so here's something that I believe. We know we have an unacceptable achievement gap. We know who's successful. We know that if your mother, if your father was educated, he'll do well. It doesn't matter what we do. Go ahead. We know that if you're born into a middle-class family, he'll do well. We don't matter so much. We know that current practices directly contradict research. I believe that high expectation and all of the emphasis we're putting on high expectation, if we don't change the basic structure, then we're actually doing more harm than good for our family. Our parents start blaming themselves. Our children start blaming themselves. The kids in your classroom, if you give them high expectations, but don't give them the support and the scaffold they need, they blame themselves. I believe that teaching with best practices for the most needy kids is not only ineffective, but can really be harmful to children. And so we're in this place where we have No Child Left Behind, linked to Wyoming, and one of the few states who still believe in it. We're at 100% right now. We're under federal sanctions because 100% of our students need to be proficient. My classroom is filled with kids that have been in this country for 1 year, for 2 years. They don't speak the language. I have a special needs population in my classroom. I have life skills kids in my classroom. Yet 100% have to be proficient. We've never attempted to do this. No nation has attempted it. If you really look at the current educational model, well, it seems to have changed a lot. There's an awful lot that still continues there. And so, in the age of inclusion and EL, I believe our model really needs to change. There's another really hard one. Press the button. There you go. And so, children raised in poverty, I think a lot of you might know a lot of this information, but I think it's worth looking at again, even if you already know it. So 40% of children raised in poverty have 2 areas of functioning deficiency by age 3. The vocabulary difference by age 3 is astounding. So SES meaning social economic status. The daily parent-child interactions are huge. So internationally, if we go beyond our country, just the social economic status alone is equivalent to over a year of schooling. And can you stop it here? But this is what is the scariest to me, and this is current. This is 2012. So 6% of the students in those areas of poverty, areas of need, only 6% BPI, meaning that they scored higher than we would predict their outcome to be. And that's in our current model. And I don't want the last slide, so go ahead. Thank you. Moving it off. So I started to look beyond, like, what is disruption? What is innovation? Who's doing it well? And Finland always comes to the top of the list. And so what did they do there? Well, they don't even bother to start school until age 7. You know, the kids need to be kids and they have to be ready. Right? Elementary school, it's 4 hours long. In those 4 hours, they have 15-minute breaks between every class. This is my favorite. Every administrator teaches a class, knowing that if you're too far removed from the classroom, it takes moments to forget what it's like to step foot in there. There's no standardized testing until 5th grade. And they did that purposefully to eliminate teacher bias, because we all know that no matter who we are and however hard we try, when I look at a kid, instead of seeing Jose, I see 1%. Instead of seeing Cecilia, I see 6%. And maybe that's my brain because I'm so driven by data, but I think we all do it in different ways. They teach to mastery. Anybody who's as old as I am knows that we used to do that. We taught to mastery. We taught every kid so that they had a foundation to build on. And so what is disruption and how can it help us in our schools? Disruption is just simply a theory that describes the way people interact and react with each other. Clayton Christensen wrote an amazing book. I don't know if anyone read what this class, a couple of you, where he describes disruptive innovation, which is the idea that we as a system are not going to we're not going to be innovative on our own. Somebody has to push it towards us. But more importantly, this is what stuck with me from his book. Educational research can only improve, and as he states, he believes it's in its infancy. Our criteria for success is 60% of the kids, in some cases even lower. Educational research can only improve, it can only help the neediest kids if we look at the outliers and the anomalies. It doesn't help us to look at what works for most kids. They're doing okay. Khan Academy, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, one of the big disruptors right now. Go ahead. He had something in his book that really caught my attention. 50% of students consistently outperform their IQ. If we give them a chance, if we don't tell them they can't do it, the rest of all, we'll figure it out. Can we go ahead to the next one? And I'm going to try and play just a tiny bit of the video. I think I'm going to have to play it from this one. Because we have... Oh, I was supposed to start in the middle. Okay, stop it. I'm going to just... Yeah. No, I think I'm going to stop it. I'm just going to say it because I'm not going to be able to find it. It was perfectly this morning. I had intended that was right in the middle, just like you two taught me. So he said something really, really interesting when he started Khan Academy. And he, as you know, his story, I'll tell you briefly. He started out tutoring cousins. He figured out that he was pretty good at getting this cousin to listen, but only when he kind of took a step back and let the computer do it. He figured out that looking at his voice intimidated the cousin. So he kind of thought, I'll just post videos, and as you know, all of a sudden it exploded. And millions and millions of users are using his site. But the piece of the video that I wanted you to watch was his analogy to teaching to mastery. And he equated it to building a house. And he said, okay, so say you build a house, and the inspector comes, and you're on the first floor, about 80, 85% okay. It looks pretty darn good. And then you put the second floor on. And the inspector comes, I think got about 85% of this thing pretty well built. And then you put the third floor on, and then you put the fourth floor on, and all of a sudden the house crumbles to the floor. And he equated that to how we're teaching math and science and reading in our schools. Go ahead. And so he now has 600 or 6 million unique users doing 500 million exercises middle school, we have a couple test classes where they're doing the flip classroom, where they're actually having kids do simple work on Khan Academy during the school day, and teachers are working with project-based learning with the others. And this graph is something from his website, and his point was that if you take some kids that have never succeeded and simply let them go at their own pace, starting from the base zero, this is a 5th grade class where they started at a kindergarten, 1st grade level, and just works through it. All you need to do is get 5 correct and move on, so they move pretty quickly. And some of those kids that were in the lowest percentile starting 5th grade quickly climbed to the top. And his prediction is that in not too many years, it could be that 80% of our middle and high school kids are taught with computer-based learning, giving teachers the ability to be coaches, to be mentors to kids instead of teaching content. So why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we listening to current research? And this is where I started to go, because none of it made sense to me. We have all this research. I had research for my own kids, yet every time I came against administrators said, nope, that's a little too scary. We're afraid. So I started reading about fear. I started reading about neuroscience. I started reading about things that made me really uncomfortable because I had nowhere near enough background to understand what I'm reading. But I read books and papers anyway. And Howard Gardner wrote a really interesting book called The Science of Fear. And he talked about how we're so wired with this system one. Our decisions, almost all our decisions are made from our gut. We're instinctual creatures. We make these decisions as fast as lightning. When I walked into the room and I stood up here, every one of you unconsciously thought, oh, this is going to be boring. Or, this might not be boring. Or who knows what was in your head. But instantly, you made a decision about how this presentation was going to go, who I was. System 2 is the head. It's the reason. And this is from his book, The Left Hemisphere, simply and resourcefully crafts an explanation for an answer or action rather than admit it has no idea. And so experiment after experiment proved that the subjects believed every word they said. There was no doubt, putting the possibility of being wrong at lower than 1%. And this is a quote from his book, The Conscious Mind Simply Hates to Admit It Doesn't Know. It just doesn't admit it. This isn't something that we consciously know. And so his point, I tried to make it cute little graphic, is that system 2 is where we write, where we speak, where we make curricular decisions for our kids, what we say in meetings, how we behave, how we answer surveys. But yet, system 1 is what we do. And there's this line between them that doesn't get crossed in most of us. And that's this unconscious bias. That's the bias that we all have, and we know we have it. Wherever we're born, whoever we know, wherever we're with, it influences us. And it leads us in really different directions. So our actions are consistently at odds with our intentions. And so then, of course, I got into bias. I was like, well, what is bias? And I found out there's lots of bias and reams of research going back to the 40s, 50s about bias. And so here's just a few that I thought were worth mentioning. So the confirmation bias is, I think, the most popular one, and I think the one that most of us are aware of. So once a belief is in place, we screen everything else out. Again, this is unconscious. The Harvard test of inflected acquisition in 1968. Anybody know that? Some of you do. Basically, they did a survey there. This would never happen today. It would be illegal. But they went into unusual potential. I want you to really nurture those kids. And here's your list. And there's 3 in your class. And they are really unusual kids. And they had actually given a task but ripped it up. And they picked kids at random. And in second grade, if they caught them early enough and they gave kids a chance, these kids, your average kids, some high, some low, grew by an average of 20 IQ points when they were tested over the year. The 5th graders grew a little bit less. So simply by showing kids they believed in them, giving them that little extra attention, the way that we interact unconsciously with kids completely changed who they were as students. Now this was the scary one, and study after study showed this. So if I'm a teacher, if I'm a scientist, whoever I am, the more passion I have, the more bias I have. So if you give me a paper, and they did this to college kids, to researchers, to professors, they gave them papers. 50% of it was pro and 50% con, whatever it was that they most strongly believed in. And then they put them under the MRI, and the neurons didn't even fire when they read the facts that they disagreed with. Their neurons went crazy when they read what they believed in. Now it's even worse when you get a bunch of them together. And so it's commonly proven that when people who share beliefs get together, they become even more convinced, and then the group opinion is even more extreme than individual opinion. The conforming bias, I think, was one of the scariest. And this was a true study done multiple times with university kids. And they gave them in the classroom, they gave them these 3 lines. There were a bunch of other people in there, and they had these little clickers, and they could click in. And so they said, okay, which line is longest? Well, we all know which line's longest. Which one? A, right? A's longest. But yet, first of all, the guy with the hat in the back of the room, he clicks in B. And then, the girl in the green jacket, she clicks in B. And next thing, everybody's clicking in B, and fully a third of the participants click B. Even when dissenting would cost nothing, it didn't matter. No one's going to judge them. No one even knew. The person that was taking the test thought everybody was truly taking the test for real. It wouldn't cost a thing, yet they still conformed. And so this was his quote from the book. So in another experiment where there was no right answer, almost 80% of participants just simply didn't participate. Because, oh my gosh, because let me know. They just went along. Go ahead. I'm not going to get into all these, but they're fascinating. So pick up some books because they're really, really interesting. But this one I will say briefly. So the NFL, the good bad example. Has anyone heard of this NFL study? I thought it was really interesting. So in they did a 16-year study. Teams wearing black uniforms were assessed more penalty in every season but one. And that was true even when they switched colors later on. So if they started the year in black, they're still getting more penalties by the end of the year. And so that, you think about, well, how did this happen? How is it possible, right? In education, in any field, the financial crisis. I mean, take anything that goes around, and we realize in an age of information, where information is so accessible, it's even easier to find information that that's what we believe. And so I keep going back to my principal, who I will never forget and always thank, really, for helping me to see this. Because after all this research, the first time, I actually in the end, she did me the biggest service that any boss could ever do. Go ahead. I'm going to skip over this, but it's really interesting. So the IKEA fact is simply saying that when we build it, we like it more. Go ahead. The optimism bias is another really interesting one. We may have just a minute to play the first minute of hers down the lower arrow on the left.
I'm going to talk to you about optimism, or multitasking the optimism bias. It's really amazing that we've been studying in my lab for the past few years, and 80% of us have it. It's a tendency to overestimate our likelihood of experiencing good events in our life, and underestimate our likelihood of experiencing bad events. So we underestimate our likelihood of suffering from cancer, being in a car accident, we overestimate our longevity, our career prospects. In short, we're more optimistic than realistic, but we're oblivious to the fact. Thanks, Mary.
So I think that unconscious bias is so important. She goes on to say, which I think is really, really interesting. While we overestimate our own abilities, we run around underestimating the abilities of others. So while we're in a room and we're trying to collaborate and co-teach and work with others, time after time, the participants were queried about what happened in the room. Thought, wow, if only I could have just gotten a little more my way. If only we could have just pushed it a little more this way, we'd be so much better off. And so that kind of gets you to thinking about, the hidden cost of fear, the hidden cost of bias, to ourselves, to our students, to the parents of the students we work with, to society. The hidden costs are astronomical. What does this fear, what does this unconscious bias do when we step into the classroom with our students? So I would like to leave this hopeful and keep going. Some of you, I'm sure, know who this is. We try basically to bring it down to a really simple point. If students have interest, education happens. And so Monique White said something at the beginning of her that just rang so true for me. She said, and I quoted it because I wanted to make sure I kept this. She said, well, I didn't feel like I could do my work. And so I stepped outside. And so I don't know who's in this room. I don't know if we have anybody. Is anybody in public education? Few of you. So thinking that, yes, we can't really change the system from being a peon, which is what I learned. We have to collaborate. We have to figure out a way to make connections. We have to somehow work our way through. But yet, we can continue to think about these kids and think about how can we change that. Keeping in mind, which, I can't help with the data, that when that flipped classroom, look at all the kids in for us. There is no one solution that's going to work for kids. These kids, they might have been the ones up here had the classroom not been flipped. So there's no one solution for every student. And so in the end, we're just left with having to look in each and every one of our students' eyes and look for that light. Because until we confront our bias, until we actually believe that these biases exist, until we befriend them, we can only look for the light and really hope that the Cecilias and the Jose's and we can find a way to succeed in spite of us. Thank you. Questions? Comments? Yeah, and there's, I'm so glad you mentioned that. It's not apples to apples, and no, it is not. But Finland does have 11% EL. We obviously have a higher number. They do have the highest percentage of parents who leave. The socioeconomic status is higher. You can't discount free daycare, free health care, free public education. You can't discount that there's all these benefits. But one thing they do that is so different than we do is they have a completely different model of what they call special education. So they catch every kid early. Like there's a graph that I had in here and I took out, but it's really interesting. And it shows sort of the special education model. And, when we're up here, sort of here, and they're here. And this is the number of kids in services. So this is the U.S. and this is Finland. And so they catch all their kids early. So they go to public funded preschool. They know who the college kids are. They know the low literacy. They know the low language kids. And they catch them early. And they put a lot of systems in place. So by the time they get here, which is middle school, they're very low. We wait till about third grade before we start identifying most of our kids. And so by the time our kids really need it, it's really hard to catch up. And so, our special education goes completely the opposite way. I'm going to erase that before that's captured forever. Okay. Yeah. I really enjoyed the book. Did you have a chance to share that with the classroom of integrating company teachers? No, I was asked not to do that yet. Are you going to get there? I hope so. I'm hoping to do a much bigger project. No, I think it would be really, really powerful. It was certainly powerful for me. And actually, when I first got mine, I took about 50 kids that we were servicing. And, truly, when I started that project, I thought, somebody says no, and I truly thought, sorry. Yeah. So I would say, please, that's parents because there's a lot of questions and something not to do that with us. Okay. Thank you for the fabulous job.